Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unraveling a massive and honestly pretty fascinating economic puzzle. We're going to look at how sweeping, high-level macroeconomic policy shifts actually trigger a domino effect that lands right in your personal bank account. We hear all the time about these big decisions made in high offices, right? But we rarely map out exactly how those decisions ripple down to the money we spend, the houses we buy, and the investments we hold. Well, today, we are connecting those exact dots using the data. Let's get into it.
Here's our roadmap for today. 1. The Federal Reserve shakeup. 2. The housing market domino. 3. The national debt dilemma. 4. The financial repression playbook. And 5. Shielding your wealth.
Section 1. The Federal Reserve shakeup. The May 15th appointment.
All right, so our entire domino chain starts with the appointment of Kevin Warsh as the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. But before we go any further, we got to bust a huge myth about the Fed. Because despite the name, it's not actually a bank you or I can deposit money into. It's not a reserve sitting on some giant vault of cash. And, surprisingly, it's not even technically federal. The U.S. government can't directly dictate what it does. However, the president does get to appoint its chairman. And that matters. It matters immensely because this chairman influences two massive economic levers, printing money and setting interest rates.
And that brings us to the new administration's clear, stated objective. The current administration has explicitly said they want to drastically lower interest rates. The president literally declared, "We should be paying the lowest interest rate of everybody." Now, looking at this neutrally, this is the overarching policy goal that sets our whole economic domino chain into motion. An appointee totally aligned with this goal could aggressively push to slash those rates.
Section 2. The housing market domino, rates and real estate. So, what exactly happens when those rates drop? The macro policy of the Fed moves straight down to the micro level, starting with the most tangible thing for most of us, housing. To put this into perspective, let's look at the real-world impact of rate cuts on, say, a $500,000 house. Let's assume you put 20% down and finance the remaining $400,000. At a 7% interest rate, your monthly payment is roughly $2,661. But if the Fed slashes rates and mortgages fall to 4.5%, that exact same mortgage payment drops to just over $2,026. You are saving over $600 every single month. That's huge. It makes buying a house significantly more affordable for the average person. Though, keep in mind, it does carry the risk of sparking crazy bidding wars and driving up home prices if the supply of available houses stays low.
But the domino effect goes way deeper than just new homebuyers. It triggers this massive economic pipeline effect. Step 1, mortgage rates drop. Step 2, this unlocks what we call the invisible number, that massive home equity millions of Americans have built up over the last 6 years as home prices surged. Suddenly, people take advantage of the lower rates to do cash-out refinances, which leads to Step 3, a massive consumer spending boom.
We've actually seen exactly how this plays out really recently. Just look back at the 2020 to 2021 refinance boom. 14 million Americans refinanced and pulled out a staggering $460 billion in cash. Think about that scale. And historically, when people pull cash out of their homes, they don't just lock it away in a savings account, right? They spend it. They remodel their kitchens, they finish the basement, they buy new appliances. This is exactly why major retailers like Home Depot and Lowe's are essentially begging for rate cuts, because that injected cash stimulates the entire consumer economy.
Section 3. The national debt dilemma. The $39 trillion problem. Now let's see how this builds to the hidden, overarching agenda behind this aggressive push for lower rates. Because, spoiler alert, it's not actually just about helping you remodel a kitchen. It's about this number. $39 trillion. This is the number that literally keeps economists awake at night. That is the staggering, almost incomprehensible scale of the national debt that the United States government currently has to manage and service.
To really understand why this is such a crisis, let's impartially look at the government's math problem using the source's figures. The U.S. government brings in roughly $5 trillion in tax revenue. Okay, sounds like a lot. However, it's projected to spend around $7 trillion. So what does that mean? It means every single year, the government is essentially living on a $2 trillion credit card. They have to borrow that $2 trillion just to cover the gap.
And just like your personal credit card, that borrowing comes with interest. Right now, a full 20%, literally 20 cents of every single tax dollar collected, goes strictly toward paying the interest on the national debt. We're not talking about the military or infrastructure or healthcare here, just interest. It is a massive, incredibly fast-growing drain. But if the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates, the government can refinance its massive debt, which instantly frees up hundreds of billions of dollars in interest payments.
Section 4.
the financial repression playbook, historical precedent.
So, how does a government get out of a debt hole that deep? History shows us they rarely do it by cutting their own spending. Instead, they use a strategy we're calling the financial repression playbook. To understand it, we got to look back at the post-World War II era. Because, you know the saying, while history doesn't exactly repeat itself, it certainly rhymes. Notice the perfect and honestly slightly alarming historical parallel here. Back in 1946, after funding the New Deal in World War II, the U.S. had a debt-to-GDP ratio of 121%, meaning the debt was actually larger than the entire economy. Fast forward to today, we have $39 trillion in debt against a $30 trillion economy. Our current debt-to-GDP ratio is 130%. It perfectly mirrors and actually exceeds the crisis of 1946.
So the absolutely crucial point here is how the government solved that 1946 crisis. They used financial repression. This is basically an economic environment where the government keeps interest rates artificially lower than the rate of inflation. By doing this, the government essentially gets to borrow money for free. But there's a catch, right? It comes at the expense of everyday savers. People whose money is sitting in the bank literally lose purchasing power because inflation is running hotter than the interest they're earning.
But did it work for the government? Well, look at the timeline. Between 1946 and 1974, the actual dollar amount of the national debt didn't go down, it actually went up. But because the government was borrowing for free and injecting that money into the economy grew incredibly fast. By 1974, the GDP had outpaced the debt so vastly that the ratio shrank from 121% all the way down to a very manageable 25%. And that is the exact playbook that these new rate cuts could be opening up again right now.
Section 5. Shielding your wealth. Think like an investor. Okay, so if we're entering an era of rate cuts, potential inflation, and financial repression, how do you actually protect yourself? The source material outlines some specific strategies for investors to shield their wealth as these dominoes start to fall. It highlights 5 specific asset classes that historically act as potential hedges during this type of shifting economy. Now, keeping in mind, this is an explainer of the source's concepts, not direct financial advice. But understanding these vehicles is exactly how you start thinking like an investor. We've got real estate, gold, tips, the S&P 500, and foreign markets.
Real estate directly benefits from those cheaper mortgages we just talked about. The source notes that ETFs like VNQ offer broad U.S. real estate exposure, while XHB focuses on home builders, who obviously profit when construction booms. Then there's gold, referenced through paper gold ETFs like GLD. The source explains that gold doesn't produce value itself, it doesn't pay a dividend, but rather it acts as an alternative savings vehicle. It's a historical hedge that people flock to when money printing spikes and they're worried the dollar is losing its purchasing power.
The final 3 vehicles focus on specific types of growth and protection. So we have TIPS, accessible via funds like SCHP. These are Treasury inflation-protected securities, which are essentially government loans where the interest rate actually adjusts upward if inflation rises. Pretty handy. Then, to bet on the underlying growth of the economy fueled by lower rates, the source points to broad U.S. equities like the S&P 500 via the SPY ETF. And finally, if domestic inflation makes you nervous, the analysis suggests looking outward for international diversification, using ETFs like VEA for developed countries or VWO for emerging markets.
Which brings us to the ultimate question. We've seen the data, we've traced the policy from the Federal Reserve all the way down to mortgage rates, the national debt, and the historical playbook of financial repression. The overarching message from our source material is incredibly clear. Massive macroeconomic shifts are in motion as we speak. So if history is indeed about to rhyme, is your portfolio ready for the music? Thanks for joining us for this explainer. Keep learning, keep analyzing, and we'll see you next time.